So I wasn't actually planning on making this tutorial today. I actually had a different plan for today, but I look at my email and I see somebody mentioned me on Reddit, which barely ever happens. I go to the Reddit post and they're talking about this post and they're like, how do you make it? And I'm thinking to myself, how do you make it? So I figured it out. I made a little blend describing, how to do the thing. It's completely procedural. You can like move the thing around and it's not like literally the exact same effect, but it has all the principles you need to remake it, as close as possible. So today, let's talk about how to make this infinite tunnel thing with a stripe. I don't know. It's going to be easy to make, and it teaches you quite a bit. So starting exactly at 9:11. Okay, let's do this. So I'm going to be using Blender version 2.93. You use whatever you want. I frankly do not give a fuck. So take all your objects and delete them. And what we need to do is we need to make this kind of tunnel thing with a circle and a camera. Long story short, let's start with the tunnel. So to do this, I'm going to actually start off with a cylinder, which might be a weird choice. You might think that, but it's already a tunnel. You just take it and you make it 3 vertices, and now it's a triangular tunnel. Take this, I'm going to open up the top so we can peer into it in a very consensual way. I'm going to be able to peer into this tunnel and also take the bottom thing, and I'm just going to move it down a lot. The reason I'm going to do this instead of like adding more stripes later in proceduralism, the reason I do this is we're going to be using a perspective camera, and the further down this goes, the more depth this tunnel feels like it has. So really do bring it down, and when we look at this from the top view, but not an orthographic view, you want to have a perspective camera, it's going to look like this triangle is very tiny in here, even though it's just like a long tunnel. Okay, let's set up a nice viewing camera so that I don't have to keep doing this weird top view thing. So in the camera, I'm just going to center its rotation and center its location and just move it up so that it's facing the tunnel. Now, for centering, you might think what you want to do is do this, but you can see it actually changes the perspective. And this is what I mean by having a perspective-based tunnel. It looks like this inner triangle is moving relative, whatever. Instead of doing that, I recommend going into the Shift X and Y, and that lets us kind of move the camera without changing perspective. It's almost as if the world was a sphere and you're tilting up the camera is kind of what this shift does. Don't worry about it, okay? We've made a triangle, and let's also make a circle. So mesh, I guess you could do a cylinder. I'm just going to do a circle with a lot of vertices. The modeling is indeed the most boring part of the tutorial. I agree with you. Set up a circle so that it's like roughly in the correct position, although I guess it's not perfectly centered. You want the corners touching the circle. And now we just got to give this thing a bit of thickness. So edit mode, select all the vertices, extrude on the Z-axis, and I'm just going to scale it. And during this whole tutorial, we're going to be doing a bunch of weird things with perspective where you might think, oh, we need to flatten this ring. We don't, because from the perspective of the camera, it still looks like a circle. So we're going to be doing a lot of things like that. So make your little circle. And again, I'm going to do this shifting of the camera, which for now, for some reason, now it's going to be a different value, something like that. Beautiful. I think we're ready to get to the interesting part of this tutorial. So shading, this is where the magic's going to happen. So in rendered view, I'm going to be using Eevee. I just want to set up our scene. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give this a white background since that's what it's supposed to have. Also in the render tab, color management, since this is mainly, it is going to be a black and white render. We want to make sure that our blacks and whites are as black and as white as they can be. Long story short, take Filmic, set it to standard, and you can see it brightens everything up. This takes the brightest white and makes it, where it should be. Long story short. Okay, so we've set up our scene. Let's make the thing. Starting off with our tunnel, I'm going to make a material, and I'm just going to add in the stripes. What's the fastest way to do that? Wave texture. So wave texture, plug that in. You can see it kind of looks correct, but the projection's incorrect. So just take this, and instead of projecting it from left to right on the x-axis, we want to do it top to bottom as we go like interior in depth, if you know what I mean. That's going to be the z-axis. And you can see already we have stripes that kind of match the perspective, and it moves with the mesh. So you can see that that's kind of the core idea here. To make this look good, first of all, I don't want this like gradient. I want it to either be a black stripe or a white stripe. So a good way to filter that is through a math greater than node. So I'm saying if this input is greater than 0.5, make it white, otherwise black. It's a harsh, unforgiving, no second chances kind of cutoff. Cool thing about this though is we can animate it as well though. Okay, so we have a cutoff. Other things to do super quickly, this ring, I want to make it black. Fastest way to do that, make a material without anything in it. A blank material is in fact black. And also, even though this looks like there's like a black border around the triangle, that's actually just the wave texture. So you can see now we have a white border around it. We also need to make a black border around the triangle. So I'm just going to select these vertices. I'll show this in solid mode. I'm going to extrude it up, and just like in the last thing, you could either scale it up or scale it down, and these are going to be the border faces that from the correct perspective look fine. So this is going to be our border. Let's give this another material. That's the fastest way to just make it black all the time instead of doing some math. So I'm going to make another material. I'm going to call this one rim, and I'm going to assign this selection so that this face selection has the material. And this is also going to be black. Which means now, no matter what we do to the, let's call it something nice, no matter what we do to the stripe material, we're always going to have a black border. And I'm going to scale this down just a bit. Okay. One other thing before we, change this. Well, I guess whatever. Let's just keep going. So we have the wave texture. Beautiful. We want to animate this so that it's going like into the tunnel or away from the tunnel. Either way, we can do this using texture coordinates. So with the wave texture, show your texture coordinates. I'm using Node Preview for these previews and Node Wrangler to add in Node super quickly. Just add in your generated coordinates with a mapping. The reason this is useful is if we now shift the coordinate system, it's going to shift the stripes on the mesh, which will make it look interesting. So if I just do the Z location, you can see now it looks like it's actually moving through it. Why? Because I'm literally shifting these stripes up and down the Z axis, which from the correct perspective looks like something interesting. Let's automate this. I'm going to add in a driver. Hash frame gives you the frame number, frame 1, 2, 3. As you play it, it just pulls the frame number. And I'm going to make it 30 times slower. So it's going, wow, that is still way too fast. So it's going, 30 times slower than real time. But let's keep bringing that up to 100. There we go. Now it's not flickering as much. And this would be also a good time to pick the size of our stripes. But before I do that, since we're actually getting ready to do all the math, I just want to bring this even further down. Okay. Cool. And that will make it so these stripes on the exterior are very thick, and then they get thinner and thinner and thinner. Okay. So we have this thing moving. You can decide your stripe size at this point. So only thing you might want to consider is if you change the density of the stripes, you might want to change the speed of this animation. So originally it was at 5. I think 4 is kind of a good look. We can always go back and change it. Good way to test this is you put it in some positions. You're like, do I like the look of that? Kind of. If anything, I want the stripes to be even a bit bigger, so 3.5. So here's another issue that I was gonna fix earlier, but then I realized we didn't make it to this part of in the tutorial because I actually have a whole mental map of what we're gonna do before we even do it. So I jumped ahead. You can see this triangle is now flickering. So in the same way that we made this rim its own material and all that, we can do the same thing to this triangle. So I'm just going to select this face, create another new material. We can call this try, which it isn't short for try guy, but just, triangle. With the try, I'm going to assign this material. And just like last time, instead of just deleting everything and keeping it black, I think I'm going to keep it white since I think that's what the original looked like. So now, no matter where we move this, it's working. Beautiful. So there's our basic setup. And honestly, at this point, you could be done with the effect, but I want to add some additional layers of complexity to make this more interesting. By the way, let me slow this down just a touch. Bigger the denominator, slower the animation. So at this point, I want to add in some complexity that will add some visual interest. So the first thing is, remember how we said that I should probably save this. I'll call it available on Patreon because it will be linked in the description. Remember how we said this greater than slider is going to be the thickness of our stripes? Because originally we had this gradient. We didn't like it. We filtered it. So we can control the density of the stripe or the thickness of them, but there's no reason it should be constant. We can actually animate it so the stripes grow and shrink and grow and shrink, which is what I think the original had. So in some sense, in every sense, what we need to do is animate this going sinusoidally, like periodically, I guess. Bigger and smaller, bigger and smaller. And how do we do that? I already gave it away. I said the word sinusoidal, which is it sounds like you're saying nasal. It's a very posh way of saying use a sine function. If somebody said sinusoidal to me in real life, punch in the face. How dare you use such big vocab? So sine function, you give it an input and it will periodically flip between -1 and 1. Take trigonometry if you haven't. So if I give this a input, that always increases. Again, hash frame divided by, 10. So this is just an increasing thing. You can see the sine goes from black to white to black, and it's staying black for a long time since it's negative for a while. Which kind of is an issue, because if we were to now plug this into the greater than, let's see what it looks like. So it looks like nothing, and then the stripes grow and shrink, and then they're just white. It's because it's going -1 to 1. We want to basically take the sine function and map it to numbers between 0.16 and 0.97, just different values we'd actually want to see. We need to remap it. In other words, we're going to send this through a map range node. Boop. Again, just takes an input interval and maps it to a different range, to a different output interval. That's why it's called map range. So the sine function, again, has an input, or we're inputting something that goes from -1 to 1, because it's a sine function. It oscillates between those. And we want to send those values to what other interval? Well, let's pick a smallest value. So I don't want my stripes getting thinner than 0.5. So what it is originally, I think, is the thinnest I want them to be. 0.5, and then I want the black part to grow like this, so that it could be at most looking like that. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm basically saying flip between these two states, and I'm picking those states. So for this one, let's go with 0.91 or something. I like the look of that. So it's basically, instead of flipping between -1 and 1, the sine is now going to flip between these two values. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so this is basically the same thing we had before with the stripes moving down the thing, but you can see now the stripes are kind of pulsing. Maybe it's not too obvious. Maybe I should, instead of 0.5, let it go down to 0.4, just so it's a bit more clear. So that already adds some visual interest, so you can see. I guess you can't see it from there. It's best to see it from the camera. We can also speed up the speed of this so it's pulsing really quickly. Let me just make it insane so you can see it. You gotta really focus on a stripe, and then you can see it pulsing. Either way, I'll keep it at 10. So that's one way in which we've added visual interest, which you can really see if we simplify the positioning of this. So now all the stripes are moving to one side. But I think we can actually do another layer of complexity, and I cannot remember. I think the original also had this. I also want to add a secondary pulse, so not just the waves moving down, but I want to add a pulse of energy that moves all the way down and either adds a bit of brightness or subtracts a bit of brightness. Whoops. And it will make it feel like this thing's like a glowing energy source. And this is something easy to do, actually. So with the coordinate system, I'm going to use generated coordinates. I want to separate by x, y, and z. Specifically, the z channel is what I'm interested in, because, again, z channel is what has this information going vertically, which from the camera view looks like depth as we go interior. And what I want to do is I want to use this information to create a pulse that repeatedly moves down. So first thing I want to do is I want to control the location of this. So I'm going to take the z channel and subtract it, take the z channel and subtract a value, which in essence lets you kind of control the height of this in some sense. Only issue of I need to stop saying in some sense. It's literally, every time I say in some sense, what I mean is this is what it does. So it's not in some sense. But the issue with this is as we exit a certain boundary, as this value gets too negative, you can see it becomes all white, and as it becomes too positive, it's all black, it doesn't repeat. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to send it through a repeating function like fraction, and you can see now As I increase it, as it goes to the top of the tunnel, we get another pulse and another pulse and another. Because fraction, what it does is it takes away the integer part of a number. So when we go above 1 to like 1.1, it rounds back down to 0.1. It gets rid of the 1. Either way, it makes this repetitious. So if I was now to animate this, again with basically the same driver as always, you can see we now get a pulse, which from the perspective of the camera looks pretty interesting. Couple things. One, we could just add a negative sign and make it go interior, which is what I want. I want the pulse going inwards instead of outwards. So the negative sign, I think I'll make it a tiny bit slower, 35. And now, I guess depending on what we want to do with this, we might want to filter it a bit more. So for example, we could just like be lazy and like take our current result and like either add or multiply it with this. So if I was to multiply it, you can see we have the same thing as before, but now we have this kind of pulse thing, making it kind of darker. I don't really like the look of that, nor do I like the look of addition. Or subtraction looks okay. But long story short, I want to do a bit of filtering before we get ready to do that. So the fraction, the reason it looks so weird when we do everything we just did, it has a very harsh cutoff, and this is because of the rounding. So you can see this cutoff is very harsh. So the first thing I want to do is soften that. There's a lot of ways to do this. I think color ramp's the easiest. So you can see the transition happens from perfect black to perfect white. So what I want to do is make the transition happen halfway in between so that we don't have this harsh boundary. A quick way to do that is I'm going to take both these handles and make them both black. So when it's black, and when it's white over here, the other side of the boundary, it's also going to be black. And then halfway in between, I'm going to make it white, which you can see still has the pulse, but now it's kind of a smooth gradient because the transition point's in the middle. And our like cutoff has the same value on either end. Okay, so that's one thing we can do. Now, again, it kind of depends what you want to do with this. So if I now have this pulse, I could try adding, subtracting, multiplying. The other thing you could do is you could invert this. So this is white, and this is black. That's another thing you can do. But what I'm thinking is let's just try combining these in different ways and see what looks good, because I cannot for the life of me remember what I did with the original. So I'm going to try addition, which looks pretty intense, but I do kind of like the look of that, so I might go back to that. Let's try subtraction. That's kind of like the dark version, and multiplication. No, I'm going to go for addition. So addition is adding kind of this brightness pulse, which is obviously kind of too much, like it's kind of taking over the effect. So what I need to do is make it less intense. So I'm going to multiply. In other words, I'm going to add a strength slider to this. So when it's 0, it's not contributing at all to the effect. When it's 1, it's a lot. So I'm just going to pick a number. So let's make it 50% as intense. That looks all right. I think we could clean this up. So what are we're adding? So in other words, wherever this is white, we're adding. To clean this up, we can make it a bit harsher. So I'm just bringing these handles closer together, like this. So we still have the pulse, but now it's not going to be, let's view it, it's not going to be as thick. So you can see the amount of the stripe that's white is less. We can even make it a little less intense, and you can see how it's changing the gradient. So just bring these closer and closer together. So now you can see only a small portion of this is white, whereas before it would have been a lot bigger. So let me just redo all that. Let's see what this looks like. Okay. I'm kind of liking the look of that a bit more. So it's definitely visible, but it's not that intense, and it still has this thing where you see it happen, and then it kind of echoes deeper and deeper into there. If you want it to happen for longer, again, all you have to do, super easy to modify this setup. You just take the tunnel, you take this face, you move it even further down in terms of perspective. And the only thing we'd have to alter here is maybe you can make this triangle a bit bigger, even though it's very far back. But you might want to change the wave texture since it updates with the size of the mesh, since it's using generated coordinates. So like what I mean by that is the stripes get thicker the more we do what we just did, so you can compensate for that. But I kind of like the look of this. If anything, I think this is moving a bit too fast, so I'm going to slow it down as well. But yeah, I like the look of that. And now the last thing I want to do is actually be able to animate and control this back triangle again. This back triangle is what we can use to get different kinds of looks and put this triangle in different positions. You can even put it outside of it, which looks interesting. Again, what we're doing is we're just literally moving this tunnel, but from the perspective, the perspective of the camera, it looks cool. So we need a way to be able to animate this, because right now we're just in edit mode. When we're in object mode and we rotate or whatever, it doesn't do anything. So with this face selected, let me just go to solid mode. With this face selected, we can animate it by hitting Control H, which is going to add in a hook, which if you don't know what that is, it's basically going to add in an object that pulls the vertices that we have selected, in this case, the face. Hook to new object, you can see it now makes an empty that is going to be positioned at the bottom over there. And this empty is basically going to let us move this triangle, but the empty is something we can actually keyframe and animate. So let's play this. Let's make a tiny little animation. So I'm opening up my timeline so we can have it be here for like 60 frames and then over, make sure your empty is selected, 60 frames, and then over the course of 20 frames, it can move into the corner so that the triangle is like perfectly occupying this corner. So let's see what that looks like. So it's playing, and then it moves off to the corner and does that thing. And by the way, again, this pulse that we added at the very end, you can see it's looking a bit intense, especially from this perspective. So I'm just going to make it a little less intense, something like 0.3. So there you go. I mean, that's essentially the effect. To make it look good, you got to fine tune it a bit more. But all the general principles are here. So hopefully that answers your question, random Reddit man. And hopefully you guys learned something in this tutorial. I thought this one was interesting. Either way, 21 minutes. Wow. Okay. Thank you everybody for watching this tutorial. I'm losing my voice, but there's still one more thing I need to do. This tutorial is brought to you by Patreon. That's what I need to do. I want to thank all 700, almost 70, I think it's 769, nice, patrons. Thank you for supporting both this channel and the CG Matter channel. And for people who are watching who are not part of the Patreon, let me try to convince you to join. Okay, that's why I do this. Patreon, you can do it just to support my tutorials, that's fine. But if you want benefits in exchange, these exist. So when you become a patron, some stuff you get access to is early access to tutorials. So this video, I think, should have been available a day or two early. So you could have seen this one early. In general, whenever I can, I try to post tutorials early. So those people, patrons, get to watch them early. Blend files. This blend file is going to be available for download. Any blend file I've made over the last 2.5 years, because I upload them to Patreon are going to be a bit, you know what I'm trying to say. Those are going to be there as well. Also exclusive tutorials that I make every once in a while. Definitely at least once a month, but I try to do it a couple times a month. That also exists on Patreon. And then there's also Discord stuff, but whatever. So if any of this interests you, there's a link in the description, or if you just want to support these tutorials, which I'd also appreciate, any patronage amount is great. It's the most sustainable part of YouTube income business model. So whatever. Either way, if you find value from these and you want to contribute or you want to get some assets in exchange, Patreon exists. Thanks for watching this tutorial. You're welcome, random Reddit man. Hopefully a 20-minute answer was sufficient.